I have to say, Charlie, when I came to the room and saw this fall, I thought to myself, I have to admire your entrepreneurial ability to actually get people to pay to come and listen to nothing. Not even Trump could pull that off. Anyway, so that image, just out of interest, was created by artificial intelligence. I got onto Copilot, which is one of the platforms. I said, create a cartoon about nothingness. It took 30 seconds to come up with that. What I should have then said is, what were you thinking of when you created the cartoon? Because it would have come up with an answer. But what I think is brilliant about that, and it's really an entree into what we're going to talk about tonight, is suggest the idea that if somehow or other we were able to look into the realm of nothingness, the only one thing that you might discern in that is a divine side. All right? And I think it captures this idea of nothingness beautifully, and the meaning of that will become clear as we go on. So, because we're... one thing I just want to sort of quote, not even apologise, I'm going to say apologise for, this is very unusual for me. I do not normally teach behind a lectern, and I very rarely have a set of notes that I'm sort of tied to. I tend to have sort of talking points, and that's great, but one of the disadvantages is talking points means that you can digress and ramble, which is great, but because tonight's topic is very, very conceptual, in some respect you're going to see it's very technical, the idea of digressing is not going to work. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stay very, very tied to my notes, because I'm going to develop an argument, the threads of which are very important. So I don't want to sort of lose one or two threads and take us all really into the realm of nothingness. So this is what I'm going to do. So we're going to talk about the concept of nothingness, and probably a good place, of course, to start is at the beginning. And what do I mean by at the beginning? Well, Genesis, of course, chapter 1. I've deliberately left it in Hebrew, the transliteration is there as well. And the opening verse of Genesis, even if you're looking at that and it's not familiar to you, but certainly the opening verse of Genesis is probably one of the best known verses in the Bible. So let me ask you a question. What is the opening verse of Genesis? What does it say? Anyway, just literally.
In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth.
Right, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Right, so that's the case. As I sort of put up there, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. So let me ask you another question. When you look at a verse like that, what does it actually suggest or imply about God's creation of the cosmos?
There was nothing there.
There was nothing there, right? In the beginning God created it, which means you look at it and you say, well, if in the beginning God created it, well, there was nothing there before he created the cosmos.
Except for God.
Sorry?
Except for God.
Except?
For God.
Oh, right. Yeah. Okay, so as someone has said, as some of you said, there's nothing before the beginning. So the whole idea is that God brings, at least at face value, when we read that, God is bringing the cosmos into existence from a state of nothingness. The actual Latin term which theologians came up with in the Middle Ages was creatio ex nihilo, creation from nothing. And that's a sort of an idea that's been around for hundreds of years. It was the dominant idea, certainly in the medieval world, and so on and so on. Now what the text goes on then to do is, once it establishes that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, what it goes on to do is it gives us a description of the state of the earth, which God brought into existence from nothing, and the first creative act. So what we get is now the earth, which God had created from nothing, was unformed and void. I've deliberately colour-coded that word void because we're going to come back to it a lot later on. And darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God hovered over the face of the waters. And God then said, let there be light, and there was light. So what we have here is this sort of notion that in the beginning God creates something, and that's what it looks like. That's what the essence of God creates. It's void, it's dark, it's unformed, it's in a state of chaos, And the first thing that God says, let there be light, and there was light, which by the way is not the light of the sun and the moon and the stars. We know that because 4 days later he creates the sun and the moon and the stars. I'm not going to digress and get into a commentary about what that light might be. But the important thing is that from that state of chaos, the whole story of creation over 7 days is a story about the transformation from chaos into order, right? So God is essentially imposing order upon this chaotic mass that he has created. Now, as I said, this is reading the thing at face value because, in fact, there's a lot more to Genesis chapter 1 than actually meets the eye. So, I want you to humour me for the next, 5 or 10 minutes, because what I want to do is take you through some very, very intricate points of Hebrew grammar, because the essence of how we actually read this verse and translate it hinges on an understanding of some quite precise grammatical points. Now, the Hebrew word for beginning is reshit. Hebrew is there, I've transliterated it as well, the Hebrew word for beginning. Now, there's a Hebrew letter, which is B or bet, the Greek beta, the English bet. The Hebrew letter bet can actually be used as a prefix. So the actual can be used as a prefix, and that prefix can mean in or at, but, right? Hebrew is a bit slippery because it's not as precise as language. Hebrew is open to sort of often multiple meanings and so on. So the letter bet can mean in or at. So if we prefix the letter bet to the word reshit, what we will get is in or at the beginning, right? So we end up with in the beginning, in Bereshit, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So if we read it in that way, it certainly implies the concept of creatio ex nihilo, right? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. It certainly implies that. But actually it gets a lot more complicated because grammatically it depends on whether we read and whether we translate that word Bereshit as an absolute or as a construct form. Now that's not a term that is familiar to the English language, because when you study, I think all of us were subjected to a study of the finer points of English grammar. That's gone today, of course. So you would not have necessarily come across the concept of absolute and construct states because it doesn't form an important part of the English grammatical system. But in languages like Hebrew and other similar sort of languages, what you find is the construct form becomes very, very important, and what it actually is referring to is where nouns and pronouns and adjectives change form so as to indicate the grammatical function they play in a sentence, right? They actually change form to indicate that. And this will become clear in a moment when I give you the example. So if we go into the absolute state, the word stands on its own, right? As a single grammatical unit. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, right? Full stop. I've put that in that. God created it, it stands on its own. The word Bereshit stands on its own. However, when we go into the construct form, what actually happens in the construct form, the word is actually grammatically linked and modified by what comes after it. It doesn't stand on its own. It's linked to what comes after it. In other words, what is called in grammatical terms a construct chain, right? So there, the word in the beginning stands on its own because it's a full stop. There, it is the beginning of something. In other words, there's a comma and something else is going to come after it. You all with me? Yeah. Okay, good. So, in the absolute case, the opening verse of Genesis, of course, reads, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. But in the construct state, the opening verse will, of course, read, and in or at the beginning of God creating the heavens and the earth, blah, 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 blah. Something else will follow. In other words, the clause that we have here is dependent on what comes after it. Right? That's the important thing. That is what's called the construct state. And in fact, that's how the 11th century French Jewish scholar, he would be familiar to some of you, a scholar by the name of Rashi, 11th century biblical commentator, suggests that the word reshit should actually be read. And this is what he actually says. He says the word reshit in Scripture is always grammatically connected to the word that follows it. Actually not quite the case, but nevertheless we're not going to argue with Rashi for the moment. But he says the word reshit is always grammatically connected to the word that follows it. And thus, bereshit bara is the equivalent of in the beginning of his creating the heavens and the earth, God blah 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 blah. Right? So Rashi takes the sort of a position that when you read the word bereshit, you should read it in the construct state, and not as you, not correctly or incorrectly, but as you said, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. So what's interesting, of course, is that those of us who received an education, a biblical education of some form or another, were taught to read, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, right? So I'm just introducing you to a different way of conceptualising that. So, to summarise it, let's look at the two alternative readings, again, just to make the point very clear. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, full stop, which suggests that out of nothing he created something. And then it goes on and says, the earth was unformed and void, darkness was upon the face of the deep, the Spirit of God hovered over the face of the waters, and God said, let there be light, and there was light. So that's reading one form. On the other hand, if we follow Rashi's interpretation, the opening 3 verses of Genesis would actually be translated and read somewhat quite differently. It would read, in the beginning of God creating the heavens and the earth being unformed and void, with darkness over the face of the deep, and a wind from God sweeping over the form of the water, God then said, let there be light, and there was light. Now, as we've already said, if you take that view, you're talking about creatio ex nihilo, right? You read it, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, which suggests or implies before that beginning there was nothing. And so out of nothing he creates this something. So let me ask you the question, what about if we read the second version? In the beginning of God created the heavens and the earth being unformed and void, etc., etc., God then said, let there be light. What does that imply about the process of creation?
Something before.
There was something before, right? In other words, there was some sort of primordial substance from which God created the cosmos, right? It's not nihilo, it's not created, but from which God created the cosmos. So, in fact, what it's suggesting here is that some matter already existed, but it was simply unformed and void. So before God, if you want, the artisan gets to work, he's got this sort of mass of some sort, not suggesting it was always there. This is quite important to understand because in Greek thinking, matter was always there together with the gods. Right? The ancient Greeks could not conceive of a sort of an idea that the gods were somehow separate from nature or matter. In Greek thinking, matter always coexisted with the gods. Right? Whereas in biblical thinking, the great revolution of biblical thinking is God is separate from that matter. It's there before, which implies, of course, God at some point created, but that's not the interest of the biblical writer. The interest of the biblical writer is saying there was some unformed mass, God got to work on imposing order on it, and so on and so on. So that's what we're talking about. And by the way, in his commentary on the opening verse of Genesis, Rashi makes the interesting observation that this primordial matter that existed before creation actually began, it said, consisted of the 4 elements in Greek philosophy. In other words, earth, water, air and fire, right? So he's clearly had a knowledge of Greek sort of thinking and suggested that those were the 4 things that made up this primordial matter at the beginning of creation. Just as an aside, since we're talking about things that existed before the moment of creation, in the period of antiquity, going way, way back before the time of Rashi, we find passages in ancient rabbinic literature that refer to the world being created by means of God's word, the Torah. In other words, it's an interesting idea. Before God actually created the world, the Torah was already there. In other words, he used the Torah as an architectural blueprint, right? That was there already, and he simply used that as his architectural blueprint. So this sort of notion of something out of sort of some pre-existent construct being there is important. For those of you who are familiar with with the New Testament, particularly John chapter 1 verse 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, right? So before, at the very beginning, there was Logos, there was the Word of God which brings the world into being. It's interesting, of course, that God creates by the word of mouth. Each day he says, let there be, and there was. So it relates to that sort of Greek notion of the Logos, of the Word. Yeah, so just what I'm going to do is at critical moments, I'm going to stop and take some questions. So I've got moments when I'll do that, and then we'll do it. Because if you stop me now, I'm going to lose the thread, and you'll lose the thread, and then we're stuffed. Right? Okay. So now the question, what we have to understand is the question of creatio ex nihilo in Genesis has never really been settled. That's the thing. In fact, it remained a contested sort of question in medieval times, if not earlier, both in Christian and Jewish traditions. There was no clear agreement about how to read that opening verse of Genesis. And in fact, Rashi's view that we've taken, the sort of notion of primordial substance before creation came to being, was in fact the minority opinion, both in the Jewish and the Christian world, but it was there. But whatever the case, the lack of a consensus position, even today I should add, by the way, if you sort of Google, creatio ex nihilo and look at modern day thinkers, there's all sorts of opinions on this particular question, stems to a certain degree from the ambiguity of the opening verse of Genesis, particularly when you read it in Hebrew, right? That letter B, that letter Bet, makes all of the difference. One single letter, in the beginning or in the beginning of. With me? That can make all the difference. And the reason why it's ambiguous is because the verse doesn't actually make any explicit reference to the idea of nothingness before creation. Because I said to you, what does the verse imply? What does the verse suggest? It doesn't actually say in so many words, before God began to create the world, there was nothing, and in the beginning, we sort of read that into it. But when you are attuned to the vagaries of the Hebrew grammatical system, you can see that you're reading in one way or another. And by the way, it's very, very interesting to see the development of English translations of this. Even within the Jewish world, the Jewish Publication Society is probably sort of regarded today as the standard Jewish translation of the Hebrew Scriptures. The 1917 edition of the JPS reads that. The 1985 edition, which was the first major attempt to revise it, reads that. Right? So even within a single publication, you get two different variants on actually how to read that. Is the world of the medieval Jewish philosophers. So I don't want to say a lot about this. And they basically sort of describe creation. When they describe creation, they used a very important term, and the term that they actually used was yesh me'ayin. So when they talked about creation, they talked about yesh me'ayin, which quite literally means creation of something from nothing, right? Which is sort of confirming the concept of creatio ex nihilo, right? So in a certain sense, Rashi, who was a medieval thinker, was in the minority. He had a different sort of view. So what you actually find is that the term ayin, nothing if you want, is probably the first, is conceived as being the first and foremost stage in the process of creation, right? That's the thing. Now the important thing, and this is where the discussion is going to focus on for the rest of the evening, the important thing to understand is that concept of ayin becomes, in the early 13th century, became one of the most important and profound symbols of the Kabbalistic system, right? So it sort of appears in rabbinic thought, but the rabbis don't elaborate on it. The rabbis don't elaborate a great deal on a lot of these things. They just drop something and they move on. It's in the medieval period that they tend to pick up these ideas and turn them into a sort of a theory, if you want, of sorts. So it does become a central idea in the Jewish mystical tradition. So the question then becomes, how do we actually define the concept of ayin? What does that actually mean? What does nothing mean? And I'm going to sort of shoot up a number of different statements from the Kabbalistic tradition. So you'll see they more or less agree with each other, but there are some nuances. So, according to one view, the Zohar, by the way, is the foundational text of the Kabbalistic system. right? There's often, Kabbalah refers to the whole of the Jewish mystical tradition. The Zohar, the 13th century text developed in Spain, is the major text of the Jewish mystical tradition. So according to the Zohar, Ayin is the ultimate point of origin. It is the nothingness that contains all potential. If we go on to another statement, Moses Cordovero, who was a very, very important Jewish mystic who lived in Sfat, which is in the northern part of Israel, said, Ayin is the state of absolute nothingness from which all existence emerges. It represents the ultimate source of creation. And then we go forward a little bit in time, Shneor Zalman of Liadi. Shneor Zalman of Liadi is essentially the founder of what today we call Chabad Hasidism. Chabad Lubavitch Hasidism. For those of you who are not familiar with Chabad, their headquarters in Melbourne are in 92 Hotham Street. Right? You might have heard of the very famous Lubavitcher Rebbe, who lived in New York and so on and so on. So he sort of makes the observation, talking about this, is that Ayin is where existence transitions from nothingness to being. And then if we sort of move forward into the modern period, we come across Daniel Matt, who's actually an American Kabbalah scholar. By the way, if you're interested in sort of probing further into the whole of the Kabbalistic world, his homepage is absolutely fantastic. Just type in Daniel Matt homepage, and there's incredible resources, videos and reading material and so on. It's probably the single best resource that you could sort of come to. So, Daniel Matt makes the following observation. He says, the word nothingness connotes negativity and non-being, but what the mystic means by divine nothingness is that God is greater than anything that one can imagine, like no thing. Okay? Now, I did promise I was going to mess you with your heads tonight, right? So this is the beginning of it. So he says God is greater than anything that one can imagine, like no thing. And he elaborates here. And he says, Ayin does not mean nothing. Ayin does not mean nothing. It does exist. It is no thingness. It's not nothing. It does exist. It is no thingness. Right? It is the essence of reality, the energy that animates all of existence. So just as energy takes the form of matter, Ayin animates all of existence. It is more existent, in fact, than anything else. You see, one of the wonderful things about Kabbalistic thinking is incredible paradoxes, right? Nothingness is more existent than anything else, right? It is the ultimately simple thing, so simple that we give it this paradoxical term of no thing. It's better to think of it as nothingness. It's not that it doesn't exist, it's at the core, in fact, of everything that does exist, and it is given this paradoxical term Ayin. Okay? So that's the essence of it. Now, the other thing about moving on, so that's one concept, the concept of Ayin. Very closely linked to that concept of Ayin in Kabbalistic thinking is another foundational idea, and that is the idea of God as Ein Sof. God is without end. Now, what do we mean by this? In fact, this refers to the infinite, the boundless, but most importantly, the unknowable aspect of the divine, which existed before creation. In other words, this Ein Sof, this unknowable, this infinite, this boundless aspect of the divine exists before all came into being. This is the source of all being. So we have this statement from the Zohar. Remember I talked to you before, the Zohar was the foundational text. Before he, that is God, or the divine, gave any shape to the world, before he produced any form, he was alone. He was without form and without resemblance to anything else. And this is where the unknowable aspect of the divine comes in. Therefore, who can comprehend how he was before creation? Right? So this is the unknowable, the infinite, etc., etc. So who can comprehend the divine? So to sort of elaborate a little bit on, to make it a bit clearer, so the Ein Sof is in fact the unknowable God in himself. The unknowable God himself, apart from his relationship to the created world, but also at the same time the source of all that is. So this is a sort of an interesting idea. It's the unknowable God in himself apart from his relationship to the created world, because the moment when God enters into a relationship with the created world, he becomes knowable. Right, you with me? Before that, he's unknowable. It's only at the moment that he creates the world that he becomes the knowable God. Right? Because without that happening, we could never know what God is. Right? Now, yeah, so we're going to develop this a little bit further, but you'll see how this sort of comes into play. So Ein Sof, if we want to put it in another term, is actually the ultimate reality from which creation proceeds and is also manifested within creation. So within the created world, you have the manifestation of the unknowable God. That's essentially what happened. And another concept that I want to introduce you to, which is closely related, is an integral aspect of the Ein Sof is the Or Ein Sof, that is the infinite boundless light which emanates from the Ein Sof, right? So you've got the Ein Sof, the unknowable God, and it is this Or Ein Sof, the light of the Ein Sof, which emanates from the divine. If you think about it, God said at the very first day, let there be light. In Kabbalistic terms, what this is saying is that before anything happens, the Ein Sof is there, and the very first thing that he does is he emanates that aspect of himself, which is the light of the Ein Sof. Right? That's how Kabbalists would read that opening sort of verse. And what's really important to understand, this is a very, very important thing, is that even though I've talked about them separately, the terms Ein Sof and Ein are in fact not separate entities, but really different aspects of the same divine reality, but viewed from different sort of perspectives. So to put it in a sort of another way, the infinite, unknowable Ein Sof is often described as emanating or unfolding into the world. Are you with me? Because before the world existed, we have the Ein Sof, who was unknowable. So that Ein Sof is often described as emanating and unfolding into the world through a process of self-manifestation, which proceeds from a state of Ein, or from nothingness. Another way of thinking about it, to make it perhaps a little bit simpler, is to think of the Ein, the nothingness, if you want, as the cosmic womb. Now, I'm not making up that term. That concept of a cosmic womb actually comes from the Kabbalistic tradition. That nothingness is the cosmic womb from which the creative potential of the infinite, unknowable Ein Sof emerges. So if you think about it, that sort of opening image, that AI-generated image, is sort of the womb within which, the womb that is the Ein, it's within that womb that the Ein Sof resides until a certain moment when that Ein Sof will emerge from that womb. Okay, you all with me? That's okay. I'm avoiding more complex ideas because the Kabbalah goes into actually quite explicit sexual imagery when it describes this whole process of creation, and so on and so on. Now, having arrived at a point of infinity and nothingness, there are two questions that we have to ask. The first one is this: how does the infinite, unknowable God move towards the infinite, unknowable Ein Sof? Notice I'm avoiding the word God at this point, because God only becomes God when he becomes the known Ein Sof. Are you with me? Up until that moment, we don't talk about God. In the beginning, it was God who created the heavens and the earth. That is the known God. You don't talk about the Ein Sof. You with me? It's only at that moment where he becomes knowable God that he creates the world. So the question then becomes is, how does the infinite, unknowable Ein Sof move towards the emergence of quote-unquote God as a divine persona that is actually manifested within a finite created world? In other words, how do we move from the state of Ein Sof before to the state of, in the beginning, it was God who created? Because before that moment, he's not God. He's not Elohim. Before that moment, he's Ein Sof. He's unknowable without end. It's only at that moment of creation that he becomes the known Elohim, the known God. Right? That's the thing. So that's the question. And the second question that we have to ask is, how does Yesh, which in Hebrew means literally is, somethingness or existence, emerge from the Ein, and in other words, from divine nothingness? In other words, how do we get from the state of divine nothingness, from a state of the unknowable divine, to the knowable divine? Okay? You with me? Okay, right, that's the question. And the answer to that question of how do we move from the world of Ein Sof the unknowable God, God within himself, to the God that we know, and the God that is part of the world that we inhabit. How do we move from one stage to the other? And the basic answer to this lies in the realm of what we call the Sephirot. This is a very important Kabbalistic term. The singular is Sephirot. And what are the Sephirot? These are actually 10 emanations through which the Ein Sof, through which the unknowable God reveals itself. Notice I'm avoiding the term himself, right? Because at this moment it is not a him or a he or a she, it's itself, right? It's the 10 emanations through which the Ein Sof reveals itself, in other words, makes itself knowable, and actually at that moment interacts with the universe. Because up until that point there's no universe. Up until that point the Ein Sof is just existing in the ether, exists in the world of Ayin, in the world of nothingness. At the moment of creation, the Ein Sof emerges into the world that we inhabit, right, and becomes God, if you want. Or to put it another way, if you want to sort of think of it in different terms, the Sephirot, these emanations are actually channels or vessels through which the potential energy of the Ein Sof takes actual shape. In other words, think of it as the relationship between energy and matter. Right? I know all analogies can break down, but in a certain sense, energy is that which brings matter into existence. Think of it in that sort of relationship, the relationship between the two. In other words, each sephirah, each emanation, if you want, is a stage in the descent of divine energy into the material world. Right? At that moment, the Ein Sof is outside of the material world, and through these manifestations, God enters the world that we know. That's how he becomes sort of known. Or another way of thinking about the Ein Sof, I'm trying to sort of give you alternative ways of understanding this very, very difficult sort of concept, is the Sphirot can be thought of as aspects or facets of the Ein Sof, the unknowable God, that actually facilitate the manifestation of the unknowable, infinite Ein Sof within the boundaries of the created world, and they facilitate the transition from nothingness to somethingness of creation. That's how nothingness becomes somethingness. That is how the unknown becomes known, through the element of the Sephirot. So in fact, we could say the Sephirot are like conduits, if you want, that channel the light of the Ein Sof. Remember I talked before about the Ein Sof that channel the light of the Ein Sof, the infinite light, into the created world. Now, this is all very, very abstract, right? Very, very abstract. Now, what the Kabbalah actually does is it actually gives us very, very detailed descriptions of each of these manifestations, right? And when you put all of those descriptions together, when you sort of synthesize all of those descriptions, the Sphirot, the collective Sphirot, the 10 Sphirot, are often depicted in diagrammatic form that looks something like this. In other words, what we end up with is what's often referred to as the tree of life, right? Often referred to as the Sephirotic tree, the tree of the Sephirot. And the reason you come to that construct is when you actually read, quite literally, the way in which each of the Sephirot are described, how they're set out, where they sit in relation to each other. That's what you actually end up with, the Sephirotic tree. What by the way is very interesting is that you often get depictions, because if you look at that, that's a very abstract illustration. If you took that into sort of concrete form, you actually end up with a human figure, right? And the Kabbalah, in talking about each of the manifestations, says this manifestation is the head, this manifestation is the right hand, this manifestation is the left hand, this manifestation is the right leg and the left leg, and interestingly, that's the right leg and the left leg, and in there, hanging off there, is the phallus. The Kabbalah actually says that is the divine phallus, if you want, right? So you get this sort of very, very human sort of depiction. In fact, some representations of this Sephirotic tree are actually depicted as a human form, right? Now, if you think about it, that would have been regarded in the Middle Ages and even today as heresy. The notion of representing God in human form would have been deeply, deeply troubling and problematic. But that's another way of thinking of the Sephirot. So what we can sort of therefore say is that each branch is an emanation and manifestation of the Ein Sof. So let's begin. So what I'm going to do is, rather than deal with each one of these emanations, this is not sort of Kabbalah 101 tonight, folks. So I'm not going to take you through each one of these emanations. What I'm actually going to focus on is I'm going to focus on basically one of the Sefirot. And the Sefirah that I'm going to cater on is the highest one. We'll come down to the lowest one later. And the highest one is the Sefirah of what's called Keter. Keter meaning the crown. It is the crown of divinity. Right? If you think about it, God represented as divine, it makes sense that the top would actually be the crown of divinity, known as Keter. And that is the first and the highest Sefirah. It's the first and highest manifestation. What is interesting is that highest manifestation of God is also identified in the Kabbalah as also Ayin, as nothingness. Remember I said to you before, nothingness exists before creation, but the very first emanation of God is still nothingness. You with me? In other words, nothingness is before, but when God emanates, the very first stage of that emanation is still nothingness. So we're going to have to sort of move from nothingness to somethingness. With me? That's what that tree is basically all about. So here's an interesting question to ponder, just to mess with your mind a little bit more. If Ayin is divine nothingness, how can it actually be represented as a manifestation of the divine? Because when you think about manifestation is something. With me? So how can nothingness actually be represented as somethingness? How does that actually sort of happen? So there's a few observations here. In other words, the first point that we can make is Keter, the highest level of the divine emanation, is actually a point of transition. It's a point of transition between what's above, Ein Sof, and a point of transition between what will come below it. Another way of thinking about Keter, it's the highest quality of the divine. It's the undifferentiated energy of the Ein Sof before it manifests itself in any particular way, right? In other words, what we might describe as potential energy, to use a sort of a term if you want. It's potential energy. It only becomes energy at the very moment when it enters the world that we know, right? So this is essentially what it's about. And again, I'm going to go to another scholar here, Arthur Green, who's a very, very important scholar. By the way, Arthur Green wrote the introduction to what's called the Pritzker edition of the Zohar. The Pritzker edition of the Zohar is the latest translation of the Zohar. Daniel Matt, who I showed you a little bit earlier, was basically the lead translator and editor of that. He spent 18 years, by the way, producing this particular translation. You sort of think, why does it take so long? Because what he actually did is he went back to every available manuscript of the Zohar and so on, and tried to get as accurate a possible translation as he could. In fact, some of you might know Nathan Wolski, who's a Kabbalah scholar residing here in Melbourne. He's at Monash University. He was actually seconded by Daniel Matt to produce 2 or 3 of the volumes of translation. So it's the most up-to-date. So Arthur Green, who's a leading Kabbalistic scholar, wrote the introduction to that. And here he says this: the highest Sefirah, Keter, that we're talking about, represents the very first stirrings of an intent with Ein Sof, the arousal of a desire to come forth into the varied world of being. In other words, what Green is saying here that's very important to therefore understand is that Keter is the initial divine will to create, not creation itself. This is God wanting to create the world, but not yet doing it, right? God has a sort of a divine urge to create the world, and that is what Keter is about. And once he moves out of that urge, it's creation sort of itself. So as he goes on and says, there is no specific content to this Sefirah. It's simply a desire or an intentionality, an inner movement of the spirit that potentially bears all content, but actually none. It is therefore often designated by the Kabbalists as nothing. That's why you see Keter as nothingness, because it's just a desire, it's just an intent. God's sort of contemplating, thinking, yeah, I've got this idea, right? I'm going to create a world. And that's the first urge of the divine world. It's sort of almost, think of it, I like to think of Genesis chapter 1 as a divine canvas. Because notice what he does at the end of each day. God said, let there be, and there was, and blah, blah, blah. And at the end of each day, what does he observe? That it was good. There's no one around to talk to. God's like in the process of creating. But I like to think of Genesis chapter 1 as the artist on a blank canvas saying, I've got an idea. And he sort of splatters the paint. That's in the beginning, there was this void. And each process, he stands back and says, yeah, that's pretty good. Right? And then at the very, very end, sixth day, he says, in fact, it's not only good, it's like very good. Right? And then, of course, he goes to rest on the Sabbath because he's created this perfect world. And that's essentially what it begins with an urge, a desire, and then he proceeds to sort of keep going. Okay, so that's Arthur Green. So let's move on to the next Sphira, because if we don't move on, we're still stuck with nothingness. I haven't sort of taken you into the known world. So we've got to actually move on to the next Sphira. And the next Sphira, so we're moving on from the Sphira of Keter to the Sphira of Chokhmah, which simply translated into English means wisdom. And again, I'm going to quote from Arthur Green. This is what he says. Out of the Keter, out of the crown, if you want, emerges Chokhmah, which is actually the first and finest point of real existence. Because before this, there's nothingness. So this is the moment when we enter the world of real existence. So all things, souls and moments of time that are ever to be, exist within a primal point at once infinitesimally small and great beyond measure. In other words, the move from Keter to Chokhmah, the first step, if you want, in the primal process, is actually a transition from nothingness to being, from pure potential energy, to the very first point of real existence. You with me? So we're moving from potential energy to the first point of real existence. And he says this, he says the Kabbalists are fond of describing it by their own reading of a verse from Job, in a hymn to Job's hymn to wisdom, where he says, wisdom comes from nothingness. So all the variety of existence is contained within Chokhmah, ready to begin the journey forward. So we're moving from the world of nothingness, we're moving to the very first stage, we're moving into the world of something. And what the rest of the Sphirot will describe is the journey of divinity from that moment of first real existence back down into this sort of a created world. Okay, so let us sort of jump a little bit and go to the next Sphira, because we're going from Keter to Chokhmah. The first real, notice what it says here. Wisdom is the first point, the beginning. Notice, of course, before it was still nothingness. You with me? So we're moving from nothingness to the first point, which is beginning. So let's move across to the Sphira of Binah, which means understanding. And this is from Daniel Matt, who says, out of the depths of nothingness shines the primordial point of Chokhmah, wisdom, which is the second Sephira, which we've already talked about. Now this point expands into a circle, the Sephira of Binah, or understanding. What is Binah? Binah, he says, is actually the womb. It's the divine mother, receiving the seed. Now I said to you before, there's very sexual sort of imagery being described here. There's actual seed, there's sort of divine seed, if you want, and the womb, this divine mother that receives the divine seed, the point of Chokhmah, and the site conceives, conception, pregnancy, conception. I know it's sort of like almost heresy to think of the pregnant divine giving birth, but that's essentially the symbolic range of Binah. So the divine mother receives the seed, the point of Chokhmah, she conceives then the seven lower Sephirot. So think of it as the seven lower Sephirot as the children, right? To use that sort of language and analogy. And created being too has its source in her. In fact, she is the totality of all individuation. So in other words, what Binah does is it actually gives form to the energy of Chokhmah, right? It gives form to the energy of Chokhmah. It sort of acts as a divine womb that nurtures and shapes the whole of creation itself. Right? So, let's stop for a minute. If you're still with me, and you haven't sort of ended up in the world of nothingness, then you're doing very, very well. But let's stop for a moment. And summarise the trajectory of these three Sephirot. As I said, I'm not going to go sort of a lot further, but let's sort of try and sort of get them. And again, I'm sort of going to take you to Daniel Matt. This is what he says. Before these three qualities emanated that were talked about, they were utterly concealed within Ein Sof, utterly united with it, with Ein Sof. No image can be applied to them, not even a point. Rather, they were united with Ein Sof. Afterward, Ein Sof emanated one point from itself, one emanation. This is Keter, which is also called Ayin, nothingness. Remember, I sort of pointed this out before. On account of its extreme subtlety, its cleaving to its source, such that that being cannot be positive of it. Now, from Keter, what we see is a second point emanated in a second revelation, and this is Chokhmah, wisdom, which is actually called Yesh and being, for it is actually the beginning of revelation and existence. In other words, it is called Yesh Me'ayin. In other words, being from nothingness, something from nothingness. And because it is the beginning of being, and not being itself, it required a third point to reveal what exists, and that is the Sephirah of understanding, Binah, and from these three Sephirot emerged the Sephirot below. So these really are the creative energy of the divine. And the Kabbalah actually describes the concept of divinity coming together in sexual union, right? Sexual union. Sort of you get the, in Kabbalistic term, God is not he, and God is not she. God can be he, God can be she, God can be it, because it's the Ein Sof. But it's the he and the she of God that come together in sexual union. By the way, Binah in the Hebrew grammatical form is feminine. So the coming together of these two elements create, quite literally, the world. Notice the concept of seed before, being implanted in the womb of mother, create the world from that point on. Okay, now one word about the final Sephirah. So if you remember the sort of the Sephirotic tree, we started at the very top. So I'm going to bring you down to the very, very, very bottom of the Sephirotic tree. And the bottom of the Sephirotic tree is the Sephirah of Malchut, literally meaning kingdom. Now, what are we talking about here? This is from Daniel Matt. Malchut, he says, is the location of the actual world of creation. So it's taken a long time. It's taken from nothingness, Ein Sof, till we finally get to the world of creation itself, to this final Sephirah. It's the location of the world of formation, which is the location of the world of actualization and the emanation, until the emanation actually reaches the earth. Now, the important thing to understand is this. Malchut is also known by the term Shekhinah. There are two different ways. You can see the Shekhinah. What does the word Shekhinah actually mean? It actually means presence. Right? Think about it. Before this, we are not yet in the world of anything that is present. It's only at this moment that we're in the world of that which is present. It means presence. In Kabbalah, Shekhinah becomes a full-fledged she, the feminine half of God. And Shekhinah, he says, is the secret of the possible, receiving the emanation from above and engendering the varieties of life below. Right? So if you think about it, the Sephirah of Shekhinah that we're now looking at, which sits at the bottom of the Sephirotic tree, is where the divine energy of the Ein Sof actually becomes immanent within the world that we know. Right? It's only at that moment that the Ein Sof becomes immanent in the world that we know. And in other words, it's the actualization of creation in space and in time. Before this moment, there's been no space. Before this moment, there's no time. Because space actually refers to the known world that we live in. Before that, there's nothing like that. And that is where our world actually takes form. So Malchut really marks the completion of the trajectory of the Sephirot, if you want, from Ayin, from up the very, very top, to the Shekhinah. And if you think about the way that's stretched, this Sephirotic tree, Keter points upwards to the world of the Ein Sof, Shekhinah points downwards to the world that we inhabit. Right? And what you're getting here is a sort of a story in symbolic form of the story of divinity emanating itself to a point where it creates the world that we know down here. Right? That's essentially what this story is about. Now, just when you think you've started to get the hang of all this, and I'm assuming you still got the hang of it, right? I'm going to mess with your head a little bit further, right? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to refer to actually a paradoxical conundrum that was posed by a scholar by the name of Isaac Luria. Isaac Luria was in fact a 16th century Kabbalistic master from Tzfat. You remember I talked about before the Zohar. The Zohar is the foundational text of Kabbalah. Not the first, by the way. The earliest text that we have in the Kabbalistic system goes back to about the 9th or the 10th century. But the seminal text is the Kabbalah of the Zohar, 13th century. We're now sort of moving into the 16th century with a scholar called Isaac Luria. Now he becomes the sort of the next major stage in the development of the Kabbalistic system. Right, up until that point, you've got commentaries on the Zohar, but he really becomes the most radical and novel thinker in the development of the Kabbalistic system. Now, what is the conundrum that he raises? This is what he says. Luria pondered the question of beginnings. How did the process of emanation actually start? If Ein Sof pervaded all space, how was there actually room for anything other than God to come into being? Because if Ein Sof is infinite and it takes up everything, where is there going to be room to bring in a created world? You with me? Because this is a world of nothingness. This is a world of infinity. The world that we know is the finite world. How do you create space for that to actually happen? So Luria taught that the first divine act was in fact not emanation, but he said that the first divine act was actually divine withdrawal, what he calls tzimtzum. In other words, Ein Sof withdrew its presence from itself to itself. Like this is like infinity, and enters the mind of God, I want to create a world. He's looking around saying, where in the hell am I going to put the world? And the only way he can do is to create space, create a void. So what he's got to do is he's got to contract. Which, by the way, is an incredibly radical idea, because the concept of God, who's meant to be ever-present, all of a sudden contracts like this. This is why his thinking was so radical in this sort of sense. So Ein Sof withdrew its presence from itself to itself, withdrawing in all directions, away from one point at the centre of its infinity, as it were, thereby creating a vacuum or a void. Because once he withdrew, there was that void. This vacuum served as the site of creation. Into the vacuum, Ein Sof emanated then a ray of light. Because once you've got a void, the light of Ein Sof can actually enter that void. And that's why it says, in the beginning, God said, let there be light. Because what was before the moment of God saying, let there be light? The earth was unformed and void. Right? The Kabbalah is actually a description of how that void was actually created. And into that void, the light of the Ein Sof can actually begin to emerge. Now this is how a disciple of Isaac Luria, his name is Chaim Vital, Luria describes the result of this actual tzimtzum, this divine contraction. And this is what he actually says. He says, now after this withdrawal of Ein Sof, right, this contraction, there remained a place in which there could emerge the things to be emanated, the things to be created, the things to be formed, and the things to be made. There then emerged a single straight line of divine light, and this came in a downward direction, winding down into that empty space, in other words, winding down into the void, right? Winding down to that void. He caused to emanate, he created, he formed, and he made all of the worlds. And if you think about it, that really is the world of the beginning. God created. In the beginning of God created the heavens and the earth being unformed and void, with darkness, etc. God then said, let there be light. That's what that means, or Ein Sof, the light of God. So once God contracts, he creates that void. The moment of creation is ready, that void, and he says, let there be light. And notice, of course, you've got the 10 Sphirot, beginning from the very top to the bottom, and we get to the final Sphira where God actually is part of this world. So that's how that particular thing happens. So basically, putting it together diagrammatically, it would look something like that. So outside of that realm, you've got the world of Ayin, you've got the world of Ein Sof, infinity, nothingness, unknowing. And what then God does is he contracts, creates that void, and once he creates that void, the light of Ein Sof projects its way down into that void, and we get the creation of the world. Right? That's how that whole thing comes together.
Looks like Dante, doesn't it?
Sorry?
I said it looks like Dante.
Yeah, sort of. So, a final observation. As fascinating as all of this might be, it's actually more than just abstract theological speculation about Ayin, about Ein Sof. And the reason why that is due in large measure to the emergence of Hasidism in the 18th century. Let me just explain for a moment, because Hasidism, for those of you not familiar with Hasidism, we're talking about, I don't want to stereotype Hasidic Jews, but the simplest way of simply describing the Hasidic movement is those people with the black hats and the coats and the side curls, etc. It's a bit of an archetypal, stereotypical thing, but a shortcut of explaining what I mean by Hasidic Jews. Now, Hasidism actually emerged in the 18th century, and the best way of describing Hasidism is that it was a movement that was mysticism for the masses. Because you can imagine trying to communicate this to illiterate masses would have been like impossible. We know that the Kabbalah was taught in circles of elite. There were little Kabbalistic circles, and only the really elite, because this is very esoteric stuff, could actually access that world. The founder of the Hasidic movement, who was a mystic himself, saw in mysticism this great potential to arouse within Jews the joy of God. If you think about it, what this is essentially a mechanism through which one connects with the divine, right? Because through each of these Sphirot, you actually begin to connect with divinity. He saw that potential and created Hasidism, which was mysticism for the masses. And this is what he did. And this is what he basically did. As Daniel Matt goes on to explain, this is what he says. As we proceed from Kabbalah to Hasidism, the focus changes. Now, the psychological significance of Ayin, that is nothingness, is emphasised, and it actually becomes a medium for self-transformation. Remember, Ayin, in our previous thing, was simply the divine nothingness becoming somethingness. And he says, all of a sudden, Ayin actually becomes a mechanism for the individual to transform him or herself. In other words, the emphasis is no longer on the Sephirot, the inner workings of divinity, but on how to perceive the world mystically and how to actually transform the ego. Dovber, the Maggid, a preacher who was a leading figure in the Hasidic movement, encourages his followers to actually permute Ani into Ayin. I'll talk about that in a moment. To actually dissolve the separate ego into nothingness. What you actually see here is a wordplay. It's exactly the same letters. Ani becomes Ayin. Ani is ego. I. And what they're sort of saying, you should transform your ego into a state of nothingness. If that sounds like Buddhism, then probably you're very close to the sort of the mark, right? In other words, to dissolve the separate ego into nothingness. The Maggid elaborates, describing how one arrives at the gate of Ayin and enters. In other words, Ayin is no longer simply a theological concept, away with the fairies if you want, right? But it is the theosophical processes that have become psychological reality. So, to read from the Maggid himself, this is directly from him, he says, one must not think of oneself as ayin and forget oneself totally. Then one must think, of oneself as ayin, forget oneself totally. Then, only then can one transcend time, rising to the world of thought where all is equal, life and death, ocean and dry land. Such is not the case when one is actually attached to the material nature of the world. If one thinks of oneself as something that is yesh, then God cannot clothe himself in him, for he is infinite, and no vessel can contain him unless one thinks of oneself as ayin. What is very, very interesting, by the way, is the sort of the concept of not being attached to the material world as a central tenet of Buddhism, right? Because in Buddhism, the whole sort of concept, the reason there is suffering in the world is because of attachment. We're attached to stuff, attached to things. And the whole point in Buddhism is you reach a state of nirvana when you are no longer attached, right? So there's a sort of a clear sort of example of this sort of coming through here. Now finally, Matt also explains the link between ayin, between nothingness, and also humility as an ethical virtue. Because you remember what I said, Hasidism is trying to transform something very, very abstract to make it psychological. And this is what he actually says. He says we must shed the illusion that we are separate from God. There is, of course, a danger that the breakthrough to ayin, to nothingness, will generate megalomania. Perhaps for just this reason, the Maggid, this leader of Hasidism, emphasises the link between ayin and humility. The most profound humility is the consciousness of nothingness. And this is what he said. The essence of the worship of God and all of the mitzvot, all of the divine commandments, is to actually attain the state of humility. Namely, to understand that all of one's physical and mental powers, one's essential being, are dependent on the divine elements within. One is simply a channel for the divine attributes. One attains such humility through the awe of God's vastness, through realising that there is no place that is empty of Him. And then one comes to the state of ayin, to the state of nothingness, which is actually a state of humility. One has no independent self and is contained, as it were, in the Creator, blessed be He. So anyway, that's the story. In other words, we have moved from the world of nothingness, and through the story of the Sirot, we've basically tried to explain how from that world of Ein Sof, now world of nothingness, we come to the world that we know and inhabit, the world of something. So through the various Sirot, you get a symbolic, if you want, understanding, a description of how you get from that infinite nothing to the finite something that we sort of inhabit. So that's it for me, and I just want to sort of say to you, if you've lost the plot and you sort of have no idea at some point what I've been talking about, don't go home and beat yourself up, because I've basically talked about nothing tonight. So you're all good. Okay, Charlie, thank you.